Hello, this is Patrick W. Crawford, Moo-Ack Productions, and this is a full walkthrough of my most recent animation, Creeper Fracture. What I hope to accomplish in this little walkthrough is to have a brief overview of the workflow that I found to be most effective in creating a 3D animation, and the way that I applied it to Creeper Fracture. If you're more interested in one area of the process than the whole overview, then you can click on one of the annotations in the video screen right now to go to the recording section. Also at the top I have a link going to the little short if you haven't seen it yet. So, as a little bit of background, I started to work on this animation in early August with the intention to utilize Blender's newest improvements at the time. So one of these is the Brawny Cell Fracture tools that have been improved, as well as the Google Summer of Code's Smoke and Fire Simulation. So the first significant step in creating any animation, in my opinion, is to start up a sort of log file. That is what this is here. Basically, it is a place where you can write down a bunch of different notes for yourself as you're going through the whole process. So the first step that I do in this log file, the first thing I do is I create this little bullet point list of the major categories or steps that I go through in creating the animation. So, like for example, I have the pre-animation, which is creating the models, doing primitive sets creation, and so forth. Then the actual animation, then doing the physics simulations and things like that, going through. This is very useful because it keeps you thinking ahead in what different steps you have to go through, so you're not trying to jump ahead. Like, you shouldn't be doing your physics simulation before you finish rigging your character. It keeps you more aligned, and you'll end up getting things done a lot quicker with this sort of track or schedule in mind. So the other purpose of the log is just to help you out if you're having issues. This is more relevant to simulations than it is to the actual animation, but kind of a general fact of life is that physics simulations of any sort are just a pain. I mean, they can be fun to do, and it's fun when they work, but they tend not to. So if you're trying something out and it's not working, record it in the log file. Or if you've changed something and it suddenly does start to work, then write down what you did in the log file so that in the future, if the same thing happens, you know what steps you took. It doesn't have to be very lengthy, just a couple notes here and there. It will save you a lot of time and frustration in the end. And even for future projects, if you end up doing similar things, you can see, oh, I'm having the same problem I did before. Let me just open my log file and I can see what I did to fix it at that point. So that's why this can be very useful. So after that, you see kind of the first thing that I have in my log file list is a couple of basic things to start me up. So that would be my sort of assets file, where I have all my main models and things that I will use to create the animation. I've done a couple Minecraft videos before, so I do already have some of the basic set pieces, such as the blocks and some of the characters that have already been rigged. Let's bring this up here. Let me just bring this up here as well. So you see here I have the basic blocks that I've applied the textures from the Minecraft game into. So if we go into rendered view, you can kind of see what it looks like. Oop. Let me try a different version of Blender. I have a million versions of Blenders on my computer because each one has different quirks and ways it does and does not work. Gotta love Blender. Anyway, so I have the basic scene up here. If I just go into render view, you can see that I'm using cycles to do this animation, a choice I make at the beginning, and I already have textures kind of primitively applied to each thing. So for example, things that emit light, I already have done the texture nodes to make it so they emit light. Things that are transparent or have reflections, I've already kind of basically done before ahead of time. So if I enable these other layers, see some of the tools are like the swords, they already have some reflection on them. So basically I've set up a framework so I don't have to worry about the materials as much later. I can tweak them or improve them, but it's already set there, so I don't have to worry about it in the future. So I get this done at the beginning. Models and materials. So after that, I start to do the basic set modeling. This is important to do kind of separate from your animation beforehand. So if I kind of go into this other layer where I've already started this is an older file, of course, you see that I've only done a portion of my overall set. So if I enlarge this a little bit, you see that Well, one good thing to do before you really start to go into your set creation is to kind of draw out on a piece of paper what you want your overall set to look like, and draw like little arrows or something about where you're planning to have your character walk through and what actions are going to be where. So that when you come to the point where you're creating this 3D set, you start with only modeling or putting together the most relevant pieces. So in this case, even though I know this is going to be a cannon that I want to extend off to the left and to the right here, I'm only going to model this central part here and the parts where he interacts. So in this case, I know it's a little K piece. I want my character to walk through this middle piece here, and then I want to have him fall onto the other side and onto this kind of ledge over here. And so that's all I modeled to begin with. By doing it this way, you don't spend an enormous amount of time on the step modeling, and allows you to get to the animation as soon as you can, because you can't start animating your character until he has ground to really step on or stand on. So once I have my mini set up, let me just boot into my final version of the animation so I don't keep getting in the outdated versions. Alright, so now I've loaded up my final animation. A quick note that I should also say, something that I would have written in my log file at the very beginning, is I have deliberately decided to make my entire animation sequence within one blend file. There are other structures you can use where you have library linking of, like, for example, your assets file, but I have chosen to actually import those onto these other layers over here, so that I can easily manipulate them without affecting my original files. If I were having an animation that took place in several different scenes, I probably would want to separate it into different blend files, but since I have one sequence of animation, I chose to make it all in one. So, with that being said, I would then start animating because I have my basic set already here. So this is a typical humanoid rig. Even though it's kind of a boxy character, it's, you know, the same as you expect with IK rigs for the hands and feet. The body has a kind of separated rig so I can move him around different directions without being constrained, and all the necessary constraints for the face and emotions and whatnot. So there are kind of two different ways you can go about animating. There's one way which is called pose to pose, which is where you have, say if I have my character and each of these lines down here is like one of the poses, I would make the different key poses of my character in time, and then later on I would move these poses around in space so that they become spaced properly, and then I would continue to add keyframes in between those spaces until I get the motion I'm looking for. The other sort of way to approach it is I guess let's call it sequential, and that is the way that I've kind of approached it. I actually started off as a stop motion animator, so this way is a little bit more natural to me. The idea of sort of sequential animation or animating is you kind of go through the full motion at once, and you're already thinking about each pose or moment in time with respect to the previous moment in time and the later moment in time, so it's already timed properly, I guess. So the way I would do this, for example, I know that this first motion, I want my character to kind of be turning around on his left leg and switching to his right leg and swinging his sword. So what I would actually do is physically get up out of my chair and kind of act this motion out, and to get a feel of how the timing would be and what would be most plausible to actually happen. So what I mean by that, if I actually kind of scrub through the animation here, you notice my right leg kind of goes out to the side, and at this point I shift my center of weight from the left leg to the right leg. This is something that I would realize mostly if I were just to act it out myself. I would see what's natural. In the same way, this motion lends itself to swinging of the sword in the left hand, because I'm already kind of shifting my body to that right side. So again, that's something you wouldn't necessarily realize or be cognizant of unless you actually tried to act it out yourself. You notice what motions become awkward when you're doing it yourself, and when that happens, you know, okay, I should try and do a different motion in my animation that reflects what would more likely to be happening. And in the end, that creates a much better, more realistic and believable animation, which is very important, of course. So I basically go through piece by piece with this sequential animation through the whole length of the, let me actually enable these other layers so you can see what's going on. Start to finish in order with everything. I should make a note that just because you're kind of doing the sequential animation, it doesn't have to be perfect from the start. You do kind of want to have it a little bit rough overall, and then just add in things as you go on later. So what that means is you're still doing kind of poses with lots of in-between space, so that later on you can do this more finer movements of, like, say the foot being a little bit higher at this point than another point. You will still be layering along, but you start off already with the timing in mind. So as I'm sort of animating kind of simultaneously, I'm also starting to think about where I'm placing my cameras. So if I kind of zoom out, you see I have these kind of lines all over the place. These are different camera angles I have placed, or cameras. So the idea, as I've kind of created my set, I've started to block out where I kind of expect my cameras to point. I would actually start to do this when I'm creating the basic set in the first place. So with these different cameras set up, I then set up a primitive sequencing of my scene. So if I go into the video sequence editor, video editing, you'll notice that I have created a second scene here called VSC. In this scene, I use it just for the video sequence editor, which is this window here. And what I do is I Shift A, I add scenes from my main scene, which is where my actual animation and set is. So if I add a scene, that's what each of these are. Then I would say right click on here. If I open, with N, this menu here, I can scroll down and I can say, okay, yes, this is from scene main, and I want to use this particular camera, and I want this shot to start on this frame of the actual scene of the set, not necessarily the scene here. So what this allows me to do inside of Blender is to start to piece my animation together without actually committing to rendering or waiting until the very end, or without interrupting my animation. So because it's in a separate scene, I can move these strips around as much as I want, and I don't have to worry about time overlapping or sort of contradicting itself in a way. So what I mean by that, if I go back to my main scene here, you'll notice the number of frames in my overall scene is 430 frames, but my sequencing scene is 542. By nature of the video sequence editor, I'm allowed to do this. I'm able to kind of overlap motions. This is kind of a way to signify something that's dramatic, such as the zombie kind of being thrown off the edge here. You see it not once, not twice, but 3 times. Probably overkill, but because I have everything as scene strips, I'm able to, kind of drag and move these individual handles as much as I want without it actually affecting the timing in the original scene. And so in this way, as you're animating, you can kind of see or think to yourself how you want everything to break down. Another good note is to say that you can see here in my log file, again, I'm starting to plan out, maybe before I've actually done this, I've planned out what kind of portions of my animation I want to be for which camera that I've named. So I'm using this to plan it out, and here I can see it kind of immediately without worrying about rendering it first. A good to note is that every time you change something in your main scene, just be sure to refresh sequencer here. So with that in mind, again, I'm kind of to the point where I've done a rough blocking of the full overview animation. So I might be ready to do what I call a test render or a pre-render. So the way I do this is again through the video sequence editor, because it is there. A good note is to say that you have this situation a lot where you've been animating all night, or for a long time, and you get to the end and then you're just ready to press animate, so it actually renders out the frames to a video or whatever. And then you see that in the rendered frames there's something weird that happens that wasn't in your previous frames or in your viewport. So that's why it's important to do these sort of test renders of the animation. So what you do, if you're using the Blender internal, you would decrease the resolution quite a lot. You would turn off ray tracing, things like that, to make it just so it's quick and dirty. For cycles, what I do is I decrease the resolution to like 1/4 of the full thing. Then I go under and change. Well, I have to be in the main scene actually. I change the number of samples to like 5 samples as opposed to 100 or 150. And so that it looks like a very kind of pixely looking video when I do export it, but then I at least see what it looks like, even if it's only a rough render of what the final thing will look like. So I have an example of what one of my early ones looked like here. And again, you see that it's very noisy and pixely, but I at the very least have a good sense of what materials are looking like and how things are moving piece to piece. Because just scrubbing through the animation window inside Blender doesn't always give you the best feel for what it looks like. And this is also a good way to see if the camera angles do work when it's in a standalone file outside of Blender. You can also see that I have a number of other things, my physics simulations I've started to work on but aren't quite there, and a bunch of different things, but it's still an easy way to just kind of bring it together and see what it looks like without spending the full time rendering. So here I have a file that's a little bit later in time where I've begun to work on the physics simulation of the different pieces of my set. Again, before I do anything with any sort of simulation or any change in step in the process, I first start writing down my ideas in my log file. So here you see I have a subtitle called simulation, and this is where I start to plan out what I'm doing. What I suggest you do is type out in that file, or at least list on your fingers, the number of things or elements you actually want to accomplish. Don't just go at it with the intention of doing a bunch of different physics simulations. So in my case here, I consciously realized that I want the arrow to fracture when it hits the sword. I want the sword to fracture when it hits the zombie. I want the zombie to have smoke coming off it, and I want the creeper to have smoke and fire coming off of it. And I want the ground underneath and the creeper itself to also fracture when it explodes. So I have list on my fingers the number of individual discrete simulations that I kind of want to run. And then I go at it inside the game engine and start to piece it together. So again, I'm utilizing the new cell fracture tools. I've already fractured my sword ahead of time, but I can show at least an image of what that looks like here. Basically, you have a nice interface for ways of fracturing your pieces. In this case, I actually used a child mesh to define how I'm fracturing my sword, so that instead of using the vertices of the actual sword to make that number of pieces of sword afterwards, I'm using a basically an object that has more vertices concentrated around the middle point of the sword, where I would expect the sword to kind of snap in half and have lots of smaller pieces coming off. So I already have my sword set up, and now I'm ready to kind of bring it together and simulate within my scene. So the first thing that I do when I'm creating this setup is I want to make sure that it's streamlined with the rest of my animation. So the Blender game engine by default is 60 frames per second. Now this is also a point where you need to really consciously realize what frame rate you've been using previously. I've said from the beginning that I'm going to be using 24 frames per second, so I want the game engine to be a multiple of that, so that when I'm bringing, after I've recorded my animation using this option up here from the game engine, I just have to scale the keyframes that it exports by a factor of 1/2 in this case, to be timed properly with the rest of my scene. Another note is that if you're doing animation or physics simulation like this, you want to make these substacks all the way to max in every case. That creates kind of the highest quality result, even if it's a little bit slower playing back. So with that in mind, let me show you kind of what the game engine looks like at this point. So if I press P, it will load the engine, and you will see that things start moving and simulating. So let me explain a little bit what's happening. First of all, if I select my rig here, I can try and hold on, was it shift? There we go. Alright, so I have my armature rig of my character selected. If I go over to the logic design or logic editor here, you'll notice I have a couple nodes. If you've never done anything with the game engine before, this can look a bit complicated. It's really not, but I do suggest doing a tutorial on it exclusively, because there's a lot of different things you can do. People have built entire games using Blender, so don't expect to grasp it all at once, but I'll try and briefly show what I'm doing here. So for every tick of the game, that's what this little object does. It basically sends a pulse saying to update this action I have called Sword Fighter. If I were to go into the dope sheet or the action editor, this is the action I actually have for my armature of my character, and I've named it Sword Fighter, so that when I come into here, I have it so that every frame it's updating this animation starting on frame 70. Again, this is an example of something I would write in my log file because my simulation starts on frame 70, or I found that most appropriate. I have everything starting at frame 70 and then going to some arbitrarily large number. So what this allows you to do is have the animation running itself in the game. A side consequence that's a good thing of this is that you can tweak your animation later on and your physics simulation will still correspond to that, assuming you haven't done your final record animation to physics whatnot. So another thing you notice, if I go back into the game engine here, you see I have a little timer at the top left of my screen. I'm using that to time different parts of my simulation. Namely, I'm timing the point when this little ball here will be thrown upwards, and when I want my pieces of the sword to start fracturing and falling apart. This is a way to help me kind of control the way it falls apart or gets fractured, because if I didn't have this object here, I'll just delete it. You'll notice that when I go into the game engine and the sword start fracturing, it just kind of falls down, and I don't know, I find it less dramatic and not as nice looking. So you can kind of use these invisible fake objects as you want to shape the animation or the physics simulation to your will. Again, this is an object that I would obviously delete before my final animation. So once I've kind of gone through and done each discrete element of my animation, or of the simulations, I then start to think about my next simulation, which is with the fire and smoke editor. Simulator, sorry. I was using the fried chicken branch of Blender. That was where the development was and is still being done. Unfortunately, the new smoke simulation isn't out in the current version of Blender, so you will have to download an experimental build. I just grabbed the most recent build that was available for me. Even though I usually use a Mac, I actually ran that on Windows to do it and to render it out. So I won't go into the specifics there, but you have a lot of nice new settings that enable you to have really realistic fire and smoke at the same time. So the key thing there is I've set it up such that it will be compatible with the rest of my scene. Unlike the game engine, unfortunately, you kind of have to be set with the animation by the time you go to that stage, because you do have to use two separate render engines to do that. And because I had to move into another file to do that, I had to be absolutely done with the animation. So once I've kind of completed my final animation and I've done my physics simulation, I've baked my simulations, I would, for example, do one more overnight render, maybe with a couple more samples. Again, this should be a very quick render so that you immediately see if there's anything wrong. So if I just play this here, so I have a good sense of what it looks like at this point, and I'll see if there are any issues. For example, one thing that happened was, if you look here, well, kind of in between here, you don't see it because it's a newest version of my overnight render, but at one point, for whatever reason, the texture of the eyelid of my character got separated, and I hadn't noticed until it rendered a frame with that in it. So it was like pink or whatever, because that's what Cycles does when it loses a texture. And so that was something I was able to catch before doing my final, week-long render with my animation. So that was a quick way to catch something like that. So after that point, then I would begin doing my final render over however many computers I have access to. So at that point, I start to work on the node editor. Again, like anything else, I try to approach this very methodically and have a conscious idea of what I want to accomplish with the nodes. So if I open this, if you haven't looked much at the node editor before, it can look a little bit complicated, but it's fairly straightforward. Basically what I do is I think ahead of time what I want to accomplish. So basically I kind of like to take in the idea of Pixar's kind of concept of having minimal post-effect editing of your scene, so that the natural render is, the presentation that you want. But there's still a few things I have to add to bring the different things together, especially since my smoke and fire simulation was done in a different render engine than the rest of my scene. So namely, what I have to do is make the blur or the shininess due to the fire and the smoke and things like that, and a little bit of color correction. So what I have here on the side are my inputs. Here is the main scene. These are the main images that I've rendered out. Then I have the frames for the zombies fire simulation, then the frames for the creepers fire simulation. And then I also made a pass for the torch. If you look at the beginning of my animation, you notice there's a torch at the top left, and I just kind of wanted a little bit of a kind of a blur going through the torch. So then I have this custom node group that I've put together here just to make it a little bit neater. I'll go into that in a moment. And then I do some basic color correction. I'm blurring, I'm adding a little bit of kind of a soft blur over the whole scene, kind of helps bring it together. I've created another custom node for adding a very subtle vignette. I notice I have on only 0.4 factor. If I just go into this, is kind of what that looks like. It's typical like anyone else. And then very slight color correction. And then I have the output here. A good shortcut to know is that if you hold Shift and Control and click on any node, it will automatically connect that node to the viewer node. So that's a quick way to see or preview what each step of the way looks like. So very quickly looking at my frames, or my Z flame, or my flames node, this is where I do the blurring and the combination of the creepers flames, the zombies flames, and the torch. So again, I have in mind that all I really want to accomplish in this node is have the output be this kind of blurred, more brought together scene. So I will show you briefly. There are quite a lot of nodes here, but mostly what I'm doing is I'm screening different sets of images together. So like for example here, screen is a way if you have like a smoke on a black background, you turn the black into an alpha channel and you keep the lighter colored smoke. So by screening an image with itself, it's basically kind of darkening or changing the alpha to be more opaque. And I'm going through that with each one. I'm combining different things together. Here I'm actually blurring. This is actually the path I used for the torches, so you notice that I blurred it more on the X direction than the Y, so that's why it kind of stretches out. And I kind of just go through with that. I just try to see what works, what fits together, and what looks nice, and add more things or take things out as necessary. There's no really rhyme or reason, it's just what looks good as I'm doing it. And then again, when I've done that, it makes it a nice, neat, little organized node that doesn't interfere with everything else by having a node group, which is very useful. So at that point, then I can just render out my noded frames, as I call it, to my desktop, and I'm ready to do the final parts of my animation. Alright, now that I have my sound project open, just to make a quick note, I have chosen to use GarageBand for my sound editing, but another perfectly good open source audio editor is Audacity, and you can do as much of GarageBand, if not more of that. But I've chosen GarageBand just because it has a somewhat nicer keyframeable interface and more visually based interactions, which I quite like. So if I just kind of move that out of the way, the first thing that I do with GarageBand is I import my video. I just drag it onto the timeline, and then I get this little window here. I can try and drag this out of the way and make it a little bit smaller so that I can see wherever my cursor here is, I can see what the video is at that point if it loads. There we go. And so there's a quick way to kind of see where everything is. So as far as sound goes, the first thing you want to do is the most tedious thing, and that's where you do the placements of each individual sound. So I basically am scrubbing through my entire video, only looking for significant, very cause-effect sound effects. So for example here, if you look at the video, I'll make it a little bit larger so you can see, you see that my foot makes contact with the ground about here, and for that reason I add this sound effect, which is just a footstep sound. Another quick note, actually the very first thing I do after I import my video is I actually kind of dump a bunch of different sound files into my project. So at the very end I would have like a bunch of different variations of my steps already imported into my project. Same thing for sword sound effects. I kind of think ahead and bring together different sound effects that I think I will probably need, put them in the file so that when I come to actually place files roughly here, then I just have to copy paste over. It's more efficient that way. So, like I was saying, you go through kind of sequentially, piece by piece, just roughly slapping files down, or sounds in each according position. You're not worrying about sound levels yet, and you're not worrying about it being very precise. You're just placing it there so that it's there. So you go through with that, and that helps to realize what other sounds you need. So for example, at this point I might realize, oh, I need an extra noise for the cracking of the sword, or I need a couple different variations of the cracking of the sword. So I'll look for those files and then bring them in and just place them in. So you're not doing everything at once, you're kind of separating it into pieces. So after I've gotten everything placed roughly, then I start going through sort of like a second pass and do adjustments for levels and doing other filter effects. So this is one way that I find GarageBand to be really useful, is if I go into the info screen here, under Edit, you have a bunch of different filters for your actual track being each individual one of these lines. So you notice I have some filters added here for doing different things, such as changing the pitch around, doing some other transformations. It sounds more complex than it actually is, but it's a way to give you a lot of flexibility. Not using this so much, but going into here, you can select Add Automation, and you can add a bunch of different things that you can keyframe. So that's probably doing a little bit too much at once, but the first thing you want to do is change this to volume. If you select this arrow here, you get this kind of blue line, and wherever you place a point, that is like a keyframe. So at this point, my audio is at -10 decibels. I can move that up or down accordingly, and that will only affect the audio at that point. In the same way, if I select one of my other animations, I want, say, the panning at that point. At this point, I want to be at the center, but a little bit before, I want to be a little bit more towards the left ear, for example. And the same way with pitch. I can have multiple different filters applied on one track, and for example, just enable them when I need it to. So for example, here with the creeper, where's a good example? Hold on. Here, when the zombie is going off the cliff, I have just one effect for the zombie's sound. If I just play the audio starting here, you notice I have, even though it's the same sound effect, I have the pitch decreasing from this point to this point, so that this grunt of the zombie sounds a little bit more different from this one. Again, that's a subtle difference, but your audience member or viewer is more likely to not notice two audio files at different pitches than the same audio file back to back. And so if it's not distracting, then you're doing a good job. So I do things like that. I also, in general, increase the reverb of the scene. On other files I do it more. So you notice here my master reverb is a lot higher up. A reverb is an effect that kind of helps to make a sound fill the space as if it were larger. And so that kind of helps to bring a bunch of different sound effects together. Again, it's more relevant to sort of outside or roomy areas than closed, soft areas. So after I kind of do that, I'm not worrying about panning, tracking left and right audio yet. I'm just doing all the filter effects and the volume controls. As I've kind of done my second pass through that, then I start to work on adding ambient sound effects. So a good example of an ambient sound effect is when I'm doing these slow motion moments of the zombie going off the edge. If you hear that little ringing here, that's this sound effect. Again, that doesn't correspond to any actual sound in the scene, but that little ringing is helping to kind of signify a key moment of the scene, or it's adding more sense to it. And so these are extra subtle things that you can just think about, okay, where do I want to have a little more emotion or a little more of an effect going on, and that you can just place it in and play around with it, change, again, more filters with it to make it sound so it blends with the file. It shouldn't be like prominent or overcompassing, but a good, nice, subtle touch to significant moments. And so I kind of go sequentially adding different sort of tones in places like that. Again, I did a similar thing at the beginning where I have this long tone that's kind of gradually getting louder up to that point, and then being the loudest moment when the video actually juts in. So kind of the last step that I did in this case, I'll make this a little bit smaller so you can see things better. I've added a couple tracks to do some like basic long tones or more atmosphere, almost music-like tracks. Again, I'm not a music major, I'm not a pro at composing tracks, but you can very easily just have two tones that kind of change up and down a little bit of syncopation with notes adding and doing beats. It doesn't have to be horribly complex, but just having a little bit of some sound, some chords in the background does a lot to bring your user in. You could say you want to find some audio, some royalty-free audio files to use instead, but this gives you a lot of flexibility in that, for example, when the zombie goes off the edge here, because I'm kind of composing, quote-unquote, this music myself, I'm able to decide where the swells are. So like here I have, I've added an extra pulsing sweep, or this kind of heavier synth here, and that allows, and I'm able to scale the rest of my little music track here to match up with that point, so that it kind of brings it together. So that's the sort of flexibility that's nice of doing your own long tones yourself. Again, it doesn't have to be complicated. They're just long tones, and you can just do what sounds best. So at that point, I've kind of done all the long tones. Then I start going through, again, each track individually. I change it all to pan. You notice they're all already with pan selected because that's the last thing I did. So I go through and say, okay, this is a primary sound effect. It should be visible on both ears, so I'll have it mostly in the center. Things like the fire the zombie, even if it's going off far to the right side, it shouldn't ever be completely on the right side because you want to be able to hear the sound on either side. But things like the bell here, this is select here, is only an ambiance thing, so it's not a key sound per se, so I'm able to get away with it having it go to the extremes of one side or the other as far as the actual sound effect. So when I am finished doing all my panning editing, I then actually delete my track here, which allows me to just export the song in itself to an actual file. And then I can bring it into my final video editor and to do the final editing and cuts. So the last step of my process is, of course, bringing the rendered frames together. I should note that if you notice on my file, I have a rend bay where I actually have the frames I've rendered out. Make sure you always render frames and never actual video. This allows you to render for very long periods of time without worrying about your render being cut in the middle and losing your video file. And also allows you a better way to organize everything together. And for example, you noticed before I said I noticed that my the eyelid at one point was turning pink or whatever, so I wanted to change that pre-rendered test. So I was able to just re-render those specific frames where the eyelid was visibly pink and re-render those frames as opposed to redoing the whole sequence. So you're doing yourself a favor in the long run. I will quickly show in Blender, because a lot of people don't know how to do this, how to bring in frames of a video to and then export it as a movie file. Let me just resize the window a little bit. So just for safety, I delete everything. I press Control left until I get to the video sequence editor. If I hold Shift A, add images, go to my desktop. You notice I have the structure of a folder on my desktop that I call rend bay. That's just a convenient place to make sure I always put my renders in the same place. Like if I have a different project here, I would put it here. But we're talking about Creeper Fracture, so I go into that project. Then I go into, let's say, my noted frames, or the frames I did some compositing. Generally, if you want to use all the frames in that folder, you just press A. In this case, I'll just select a few of them by clicking and dragging. And I could say Add Image Strip. And then you see you have this little box over here, which is your image now considered to be a video. So I just move it over one. So line it up. If you press G, you can see until it's at 1. And then take note of where that final frame is over here, this last frame. So that was 5, so I want to make the ending of the animation 5 here. So you notice if I just kind of zoom that out, if I were to just play like this, you notice it already is using it as a frame. It's already considering it as a video. So all you have to do at that point is, change it to be a video. You don't want to make more frames. And then again, just export to desktop, and it will automatically render through. Animate, and there you go. You'll get a video file at the end, just like that. Lovely. Very short, but you get the idea. So as far as video editing goes, I have arbitrarily used Premiere to do my editing just because I have a few other asset files as far as my introduction logo and some other text overlay things that I've already established with Premiere. So that's what I've actually used in the end. But Blender is also much better than a lot of other commercial kind of low-end video editors, and the fact that it has layers and different tracks you can composite over. I would like to make a couple notes. One quirk that I utilize to create this sort of jutting effect, because if we look at the beginning of my animation, as it kind of starts up, you notice that it kind of jutters in, or it flickers in. Yeah, flickers is a better word. Oh no, Find is crashing. No, we're fine. Alright. The way I actually did that is I went into my bathroom and I recorded myself turning on the light. It sounds a little bit odd, but what I did is I noticed that the light flickers on. So if I just kind of play this, you notice that in some moments that it doesn't immediately go to full brightness. So what I actually did is I took some segment of this video I recorded here and overlaid that on my video with multiply, such that where it was white, it would be the full normal video, and where it was black, it would just make the video black. And so that was just a kind of a quick, quirky way to get this kind of unique entrance. So doing kind of small, weird things like that, you can, make something a bit more unique. You can have fun with your editing. I always like to. It should be fun. So that's just kind of one weird thing that I tried out there. Anyway, so that's kind of the end of my commentary. I hope this was useful to someone. If you have any questions or want more specifics about the way I went about any particular part of the process, I would be willing to answer questions, of course. In the future, I do hope to be able to create kind of a tutorial for the way you approach physics simulations with the fracture tools and the game engine, because I know a lot of people do find that very complicated, or if they find a tutorial, it's only a tutorial on how to complete one specific sort of action. It doesn't give you a sense to how to think about or how to approach the simulation. So I hope to kind of do a video covering that in the future. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you next time. Moo-Ack.